Depression is a big word today. It's a word that's thrown around. So what we're going to do today's podcast, we're going to try to take apart the word depression and give much more of a genuine insight into what is depression, what to look for, the different types of depression, and how to respond accordingly. My name is Daniel Ifra, LCSW, here in the Sainstorming Podcast, where we don't brainstorm, but we sainstorm ways of keeping each other sane in a complex world. Alrighty, so today we're talking about different types of depression. Not all depression was created equal. What tends to happen is that people have ideas in their mind about what depression looks like, what the symptoms of depression are. And as a result of that, there's a lot of misconstrued ideas. Some depressions are actually falling through the cracks. Some things that look like depression are actually being overdiagnosed. So it's really important to have a thorough and broad understanding of the different categories of depression and to be able to recognize each one individually. And then we can respond accordingly to each type of depression. Okay, so what we're going to start with today is talking about our stereotype depression. This depression is something that I think most of us, if we put in our mind and we close our eyes for a second, and how do we visualize that depressed individual that's literally struggling? We're going to think about somebody who's in bed, somebody who's not showering, taking care of themselves, maybe hasn't shown up to work, not shaven, unkempt, right? Just very, very sluggish. We're going to call that, for our purposes, major depression. Major depression is relatively non-functional. People with major depression are stuck in bed. They're not doing what they need to do. They're not taking care of themselves. They're neglecting themselves. And as a result of that, they themselves are suffering terribly, and the people around them are suffering terribly. One of the hardest parts of working with somebody who's majorly depressed is that the depression is actually freezing them in their tracks, that they can't do anything. And if a person literally can't do anything, then there's not much that we can do for him unless he decides to do something. But how can he decide to do something when he's so terribly depressed? So it's depression is something that's sort of like what we're all familiar with. There is help, but the people that fall into the category of non-functional depression, more likely that the way that they'll be getting help is through what's known as real tough love from the people around them. Because as far as they're concerned, they're not moving. And that's where we get into the support system of the family, those close to him, the loved ones, etc. We're going to move on now to something that's a little bit more overlooked, and that is basically known as what I like to call more functional of a depression. We call it dysthymia. Dysthymia is more of a daily grind of this monotonous feeling of just trying to get through the day. They're going to work, you're doing what you're supposed to do, you're holding down the job, but there's like a withdrawal there's an irritability, perhaps. Living life is really just figuring out a way how to get through it. There's a lack of drive for pleasurable activities. So I've seen people that have been living like this for years, literally for years. And they don't even, people around them never really thought that they may even be depressed, because this is sort of like, we take it for granted that this is like almost their baseline. And the truth is, it's not. The fact that it's been going on for years just makes it much more difficult to pick up on. Now, a big clue for this kind of depression, for dysthymia, could be the negative self-talk. People who talk negatively about themselves, they put themselves down, they talk about the world as a unforgiving, ice cold place. What are we here for anyway? those are big clues, because people that are feeling that way will inevitably make comments, even without realizing, here and there to that effect. So this is probably even the more common kind of depression, but underdetected depression, which is that, and again, the person's functioning. So it's very hard to make that call and say, oh, well, we need to move in, we need to do something. This is getting in the way of their life. Because is it getting in the way of their life? Absolutely, it's getting in the way of their life. But it's not getting in the way of their life in terms of basic functionalities necessarily, right? So that's what makes this class of depression very, very unique. Now, I want to just back off here for a second and say the following. Just because any of us have a rough few days, right? We all sometimes feel a little sluggish, a little down. That does not mean that we're depressed. And it became, you know what? It became a very cliche word, depression. I've heard kids use it like, I saw him walking around today. He was all depressed. We talk that way. He's all depressed. But depression doesn't mean feeling sad. Depression doesn't mean I'm just feeling down. Depression is a mindset. Depression is not just a snapshot of how you're feeling today or you felt yesterday. Depression is a mindset, a predisposition that you gravitate towards, and it's like and it will keep up over time. A person's not depressed a day here and a day there. Just be very clear about that. That's not what we mean by depression, despite the lingo that's out there. So when we're talking about, let's say, this dysthymic depression, we're talking about someone who has been doing this consistently. In fact, the literature talks about 2 years as a minimum. I'm not going to say that we have to use 2 years as a marker, not at all. But when you see it relatively consistent with this bigger picture going on, that's when we should start taking another look at this individual and saying, hey, maybe this person needs help. And you know what? Nobody has to live this way. They probably have just accepted, for whatever reason it may be, that, hey, this is the way life is. So they're not doing anything about it. Maybe they don't even have the drive to do more about it. But again, part of what I would like to accomplish here in today's podcast is educate you guys more what to look for, what is depression and what's just having a hard day, and then being able to respond accordingly. So we have our major depression, and we have which is really non-functional, and we have now our functional depression, better known as dysthymia. Now, actually, they don't use the term dysthymia anymore in the DSM, but the terms keep changing. It's really not about the terms. I refer to it that way just because that was my training back in the day. But the idea is it's more of a functional depression. Okay, we're going to go on to the third type of depression, and this one's quite interesting, and I have a feeling that many of our listeners, many people out there, are going to be able to actually, this is going to resonate with them. And what I call this, there's different terminologies for this, but what I refer to this is circumstantial depression. Circumstantial depression means that a person is in a certain set of life circumstances which are unfortunate, that's making things for them difficult, they're feeling a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. Maybe they're in a difficult marriage. Maybe their finances they're struggling with their finances. There's so many different circumstances, difficult life's stressors that we're subjected to. And you have people that are subjected to them on a consistent basis. And as a result of that, they're just broken. So that's what we call circumstantial depression. Circumstantial depression is less about the internal process of whether it's chemically based or whether it's core beliefs. It's less about that, more about, this is the situation I'm in, I'm not coping well, and as a result of that, you're seeing a lot of depression. Now, I want to tell you something interesting. What ends up happening is many people will identify with circumstantial depression. What they'll do is they'll say the following. They'll say, well, my depression is only because of X, Y, and Z. If I didn't have to deal with my spouse, I wouldn't be this way. or if I didn't have a difficult kid that's taking over my life and draining all my resources, I wouldn't be this way. And that is something it's something that we see again and again. Now, there may be truth to that, 100%. Life can be very, very difficult and can be very, very challenging. But what I've seen is that a lot of times people who will identify with circumstantial depression takes a lot less of a vulnerability in order to do that, because basically at the end of the day, you're sort of blaming your depression on something else. So it makes you less, it shows less of a weakness from your end, less of a lack of resilience, if you will. It's just, well, life is just so hard. So it's everything else around me. You're externalizing it. Since you're externalizing it, it's easier to kind of talk about it and to identify. However, the reality is that a lot of times circumstantial depression, and I'm not taking away from the legitimacy of it, but I think it's overused, because in a lot of situations, you can have people that go through similar circumstances, very difficult ones, and one person is falling apart depressed, and the other person is holding it together and doing the best they can and still making a life for themselves. Not judging either of them, but it's hard to just determine that something is strictly circumstantial, because different people with different predispositions react uniquely to different circumstances. So just keep that in mind. The next kind of depression that I'm going to talk about is seasonal depression. This is an interesting one. And this is also overlooked because people don't tend to connect the dots. This one needs some dots connecting. Basically, you'll find people that in the winter months, when it gets dark more often, it gets dark earlier, it's cold outside, they tend to go into a dark, deeper depression. And it lasts usually for those winter months. And then as the weather gets nicer and spring comes out, they're fine. They're relatively fine. And they can be completely fine. And you only see it recurring for the winter months. And there's a lot of research behind this, and it probably is more chemical than some of the other ones, that there's a response going on to has to do with the light and the exposure to the different hormones reacting to different environmental pieces. But the fact remains that a lot of people don't connect the dots here, because if you think about it, the winter months are the main months that your kids are going to school, you're going to work, you're in the daily grind of things. Summertime, everything is anyways sort of like, some people go on vacation, some people are changing their schedules a little bit, the kids are changing their schedules. So anyway, people feel like, oh, well, I don't have time to really focus on my depression, so to speak, when the summer months come up. So therefore, some people don't really recognize how intertwined it is with the time of year. But it can be, and it's very important to know that, because there are a lot of things to do, relatively simple stuff, by the way, when it is seasonal depression, otherwise known as SAD, SAD. Another depression that I want to talk about is less common. It's less common to the masses, but it exists, and that's called a major depression with psychotic symptoms. Psychosis is basically a break in reality. Now, this is a very serious condition that needs to be addressed, and it needs to be treated with medication and other sometimes aggressive interventions, because psychosis is basically a break with reality, whether it's hallucinations, it's hearing voices, it's a belief system that's completely broken from reality. And if a person has that kind of depression along with the psychosis, they're in a lot of danger. They're in a lot of danger because they may be following certain higher powers that are communicating with them to do certain things, or to inflict some self-harm or harm to others. So less common, psychotic depression, but extremely dangerous. The final one that I want to discuss today is childhood depression. Childhood depression is very interesting. We spoke about last podcast, we talked about childhood anxiety. So childhood depression is very similar to a lot of the things that we've spoken about until now. But what you'll see with childhood depression is a lot less of that typical depression, a lot less of the non-functional depression. I see this all the time. People are like, no, my kid's not depressed. He's never laying in bed. He's not just sitting there doing nothing. That is really not the way depression presents with kids most of the time. I think a lot has to do with what we actually mentioned earlier, and that is that kids are, by definition, conformists, and they do try to pull through and toe the line. And what you're going to see more with childhood depression is a lack of motivation, a lack of zest to excel, whether it's in their studies, to excel socially, some withdrawal perhaps, and a lot of negative self-talk, talking about how everything's bad and everything is just gloomy and the world is a not fair place. That kind of stuff are going to be the primary way that childhood depressions present itself. And I've had this countless times where parents will come in and talk to me about their kids, and I'm not quick to diagnose a child with depression, but it's there, it's out there, and parents are usually very, very surprised and shocked, and they're like, "Yeah, but he's doing everything he needs to do," and I'll say, "Yeah, but it's a million times harder for him." And the last thing you want is for a child to have this sort of negative view of himself or negative view of her world, and that really sets the tone for. We know that the childhood development is a very, very big piece of our outlook and our moods and later in life. So we want to really, besides the fact that we don't want our children suffering, we want to get them to be all that they can be. We have to realize that treating childhood depression or anxiety is going to really make such a difference later in life, because that's going to be the template basically of their life to come, right? And how a child develops in the earlier years is what your brain, both consciously and subconsciously, kind of looks back and uses as a default setting. So we need to sort of be aware of that and kind of make sure to intervene and change that default setting when necessary. So the idea of today's podcast was really to give you all an overview of different kinds of depression, what it looks like, so that none of them fall through the cracks, and also to understand how each one really does require a different twist. We said that the depression with psychosis needs to be more aggressively done with medication. Major depression also more than likely needs to be done, needs medication to get through. Dysthymia, it's really depending on the situation at hand. But I want to give you 2 real tips on depression, on the treatment of depression, that is worth its weight in gold. Even though today's podcast is not focusing on the treatment of depression, it was just more of an overview. But 2 important, 2 crucial, life-saving points. If you have a loved one that is struggling with depression, you need to keep 2 things in mind. Number 1 is that the goal of depression is to shut a person down. Therefore, no matter what treatment you're going to take, no matter what medication or what intervention you're going to do, the most crucial thing that you need to make sure is that you have to do everything in your power to make sure that person does not lay in bed, does not shut down. Even if they don't feel like it, it's going to be torture for them. You need to get them out of bed, take them out, take them shopping. You need to make sure that they are not succumbing to that mode of just shutting down, because that mode of shutting down is a point of no return and just perpetuates that depression to even stronger and stronger levels. So number one is, you are not doing them a favor by just letting them sleep it off. You need to make sure some way or another, get a rotation going, you got to get them up and active. That's number one. Number two, exercise. I mean, research has shown how exercise is at least as beneficial for depression and effective in treating depression as medication. So it's medicine for the soul. Especially, we're talking about chemically, from a chemical perspective, there's hormones, there's endorphins that are released through high cardio exercise. The trick is going to be getting a person who's depressed to exercise. That is definitely going to be a hardship there. But again, going back to rule number one, is that no matter what, we need to get these people, we cannot let them sit and just become soaked up in their depression, because that is literally self-destructive. So here we have it today, an overview of depression. I hope this was helpful for you guys. We're going to talk a lot more about depression in podcasts to come, a lot more in terms of the interventions and treatments. And thank you for joining.